Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And this is the last of the podcasts that I'm going to be doing on Operation Barbarossa. Obviously, I'm going to continue talking about the German invasion of the Soviet Union. And it's difficult to draw a distinction as to where you stop talking about Barbarossa. But because Barbarossa itself, on the drawing board, was meant to last really no longer than about 4 months. That's when it would have been kind of over, long before or just as the Soviet winter was beginning, and it was in theory meant to be finished a lot quicker than that, perhaps by early autumn. The actual timescale of Barbarossa is totally derailed by a number of inconvenient facts. Firstly, the fact that despite the successes that the Wehrmacht have against the Red Army, and despite the encirclements and destruction of army groups throughout the summer of 1941, by the autumn, divisions keep being reformed, rebuilt, remade, and remanned and sent to the front. The Wehrmacht and the General Staff realise that the Soviet manpower reserves are verging on the inexhaustible. And they realise that much of what they've come to believe about the capabilities of the Russian soldier has been wrong. That the Russian soldier is a tenacious fighter, extremely brave by and large, and not likely to simply give up. Many of the racial ideas that the Nazis have about the Slavs, obviously, as with all racial ideas, are utterly flawed and don't bear up to close scrutiny. The tenacity with which Soviet soldiers fight back shocks and surprises the Germans. And many of the more astute officers and men of the Wehrmacht start to have a sense of foreboding that the great adventure, the great crusade in Russia, is not going to be the walkover that had previously been expected. So I believe, and it's always difficult in history to draw clear delineations, but I believe that Barbarossa ends with the failure to seize Moscow. And that's the kind of the beginning of what I want to talk about today, really. So despite the dramatic successes of the Wehrmacht, the Red Army was still functioning and had not been broken by the autumn of 1941. The whole premise of Blitzkrieg was that it was meant to be fast warfare, with tank columns puncturing deep through enemy lines, and encirclement of armies, heavy air bombardment, and the destruction of air forces. All these things had happened. All these things had successfully occurred, and yet the size of Russia, and as previously mentioned, the huge amount of available manpower meant that it was very difficult to have the kind of outright victory that was possible in, say, France or Greece. Stalin's soldiers, large numbers of them, did surrender due to the level of demoralisation, the collapse of central command, and the effect of the purges. But many of them fought on tenaciously. The fortress of Brest was defended by the Soviets for over a week in June, and the defenders, eventually defeated, fought to the death. The report into the siege of the fortress said that the defenders were a courageous garrison that cost us a lot of blood. The Russians fought with exceptional stubbornness. They displayed superb infantry training and a splendid will to resist. In addition to this, one thing that the Germans had not counted on was the heavy tanks of the Red Army, particularly the soon-to-be unleashed T-34 tank, which was being produced in large numbers at places such as Stalingrad. The fact that the Soviets had been able to move a large amount of their productive capacity in a vast logistical operation out of the range of German bombers was, again, something that would be one of the Soviet Union's saving graces. The ability to create vast production works at places in the Urals like Tankograd, and to be able to ship huge numbers of tanks westwards to rejoin the battle, meant that the Germans were at a distinct disadvantage. The T-34 was a powerful, fast vehicle with a large gun and had tracks which enabled it to move in mud and snow far more effectively than its German counterparts. On the 8th of July, the Abwehr, the German intelligence, reported that over half of all Soviet formations and divisions had been destroyed. There had been 164 that had been identified and 89 had been destroyed. But a few weeks later, on the 11th of August, in Berlin, Franz Halder, a German general, was slightly less optimistic. He said, "It's increasingly clear that we underestimated the Russian colossus. We believed that the enemy had about 200 divisions. Now we're counting 360. These forces are not always well armed and equipped, and they are often poorly led, but they are there." The belief that many of the high command, the general staff, and the intelligence services in Nazi Germany had was that communism was, obviously an abomination in their eyes and something monstrous. And because of this, it would easily collapse once it was attacked properly. So just as in previous podcasts when we've talked about Stalin and Barbarossa, Stalin's view of the West and of Germany was shaped through Marxist-Leninism, and all sorts of misapprehensions and errors emerged as a result of that. Anti-communism, Nazi anti-communist ideas, also led to these kinds of misapprehensions emerging as well. The simple assumption that there was something so unnatural about communism that once it was given even the slightest prod, it would crumble, turns out to not be the case. It's arguable that most Russian soldiers and Russian citizens defending their homeland were motivated far more by ideas of Russian patriotism and nationalism than they were by a couple of decades of Marxist-Leninist thinking. There were obviously Russians who believed that they were defending socialism, but most of the Russians who resisted with all their energies and determination firstly knew that a war of annihilation was being fought against them. They weren't naive about that. And also they were fighting for the idea of Russia itself. And it just goes to show that the emotive power of nationalism is far, far greater, far more of a motivator than arguments about the Marxist-Leninist views of history and dialectics and what an equitable society should look like. Some German officers looked at the vastness of Russia, the inability to conquer it, and the enormity of this task that they had taken on. And they began to consider, in their darkest imaginings, what the result of failure in Russia might be, and what that might have occurred, and what they may have initiated by stirring the sleeping giant of Russia. And Barbarossa wasn't helped by Hitler. Hitler's decision-making for the three army groups, North, Centre and South, was fickle and erratic. Hitler was, of course, the consummate manager, He refused to allow the General Staff to function in the way that they had done for decades, and he intervened on a staff level and also on a divisional level, telling armies in the field what to do. This was completely the opposite of German staff doctrine, of Auftrags tactic, of allowing officers, commanders in the field, leeway to achieve objectives in the way that they knew they saw fit at the time. Hitler switched objectives repeatedly. In July, Army Group Centre, which was marching for Moscow, stopped in the face of strong Russian resistance. Army Group North was able to press on ahead and encircle Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad being the longest and bloodiest siege of the war. And despite Hitler's pause on the route to Moscow, by October, 19 million Russians were in German territory. Some 3 million Russian soldiers had been captured or killed at about the rate of about 45,000 a day due to huge encirclements, and Stalin had lost over half his troops. Those that remained were desperately under-resourced, hungry, lacking ammunition, and sometimes having to scavenge the bodies of their comrades, running low on even things like Molotov cocktails to throw at tanks. And in Moscow, foreign correspondents waited for the end and thought that the end of the Soviet Union was but a few weeks, if not days, away. Stalin was appalled by the surrenders of divisions to the Germans, and those that survived captivity would, of which there were very few, would experience Stalin's revenge at the end of the war. He was also horrified by the nationalities of the Baltic states and Ukraine, some of whom embraced the German invaders. Hatred of communism in those states was quickly turned to German advantage by associating the Jewish residents, the Jewish neighbours of Baltic, Lithuanian, Latvian and Estonians, of Belarusians and Ukrainians, and with communism itself. And the anger and often latent anti-Semitism that already existed there allowed the Germans to really step back and let local people carry out the mass killings that they normally would have done. On the German side, the vastness of the country proved to take a psychological and a mental toll on the tank crews and the infantry that marched across it. The endless terrain, the realisation of reaching the top of one hill and seeing countless others stretch out into the distance and meant that the lightning war in the minds of many Wehrmacht soldiers was no longer possible. The vehicles that they drove in became exhausted mechanically, tracks wore out, engines needed to be repaired, suspension broke, particularly on long, dusty and muddy cart tracks across Russia. There were no motorways like there were in Western Europe, or highways which were easy to traverse. One of France, Belgium and the Netherlands' problems was that the road network was really far too good as far as the German tank crews were concerned. By the autumn, a fifth of the original invasion force was gone in terms of armour, but by September, Moscow was in sight. By this point, Leningrad had been encircled and Ukraine had been conquered, and the German army had secured its flanks and was ready to recommence the offensive against Moscow. Hitler was jubilant and confident, and on October the 2nd, he described the German army's march against Moscow as the last large-scale decisive battle of this year, which would shatter the USSR. However, October was extremely late in the Russian calendar for this kind of action, and the advances that Germany had made elsewhere in Russia had given the Russians the chance to reinforce Moscow. That pause that I mentioned a few minutes ago in the advance on Moscow had given the Russians the opportunity to essentially empty Moscow of its inhabitants and have them build defences throughout the autumn. The entire city was mobilised to save Moscow from German occupation. Stalin recalled Zhukov, who'd been fired by him on the 29th of July for wanting to evacuate Kiev, and had eventually been drafted to become the commander of the reserve front who defended Leningrad. He'd previously been chief of the general staff. Zhukov was called to mount the defence of Moscow. 6 German armies, 1.9 million men, 14,000 guns, and 1,000 tanks, and 1,390 aircraft were poised to attack the city in what was titled Operation Typhoon, which would be the final assault on Moscow. Russia initially experiences huge losses. 8 Soviet armies are swept away by the offensive, and there were those that were encircled. In Max Hastings' All Hell Let Loose, he refers to the testimony of a Major Ivan Shabalin, who was one of Stalin's political commissars, and he refers to the diary entry on October 13th, a couple of days before Shabalin was killed. Shabalin had been leading a group of straggler soldiers who had been cut off. Shabalin wrote, "It is wet and cold, and we are moving terribly slowly. All our vehicles are bogged down on the muddy roads. More than 50 had to be abandoned in ground that resembled a quagmire. About the same number are stuck fast in a nearby field. At 0600 the Germans opened fire on us, a continuous bombardment of artillery, mortars and heavy machine guns. It went on all day. I cannot remember when I last slept properly." But however, the mud and the rain was a problem not just for the Red Army, but also for the Wehrmacht. And it was the Wehrmacht who had their supply lines which were overextended and were therefore potentially more vulnerable. On the 15th of October, another diary entry reads, this is a German tank gunner Karl Fuchs, who believed it was all over by the shouting. He said, "From now on Russian resistance will be minor. All we have to do is keep rolling forward. Our duty has been to fight and to free the world from this communist disease. One day, many years hence, the world will thank the Germans and our beloved Führer for our victories here in Russia." And it gives you a real snapshot into the mindset of German soldiers in Russia and what they believed they were doing, and the moral justification for doing it. So the mud began to slow down the German advance. Rasputitsa is the term for the Russian autumn rains, which are naturally followed by freezing weather. And the Germans seem to have had relatively little knowledge or understanding of this weather cycle. Even though the German army put a great deal of time and effort into understanding meteorology, as all modern armies do, what perhaps they didn't understand was the lack of real infrastructure in Russia, so the dependence that many Russians had on cart roads and muddy tracks. There was only 40,000 miles of tarmac, less than 50,000 miles of rail track in Russia, and you can imagine how minimal that really must be. And the German supply system, which was already overstretched, as the German logistics were not particularly suited to this kind of longer term campaign, became profoundly compromised by the mud. The difficulty that the Germans faced was that despite Soviet losses in the West, reinforcements could come from the East. And Richard Sorge, who was Stalin's spy in Tokyo, was starting to hear curious things about Japanese intentions towards the USA. And by November, those intentions were starting to crystallize into a decision to attack America in the Pacific. Stalin therefore gambled on the fact that Sorge was right and that there would be no attack by the Japanese to complement their commitment to Germany in the Anti-Comintern Pact in Siberia in 1941. And that meant the Siberian divisions that Stalin had there waiting to preempt the possibility of a Japanese attack could then be moved to the west, could be moved to liberate the threat to Moscow, or alleviate that threat. The snows were soon likely to come, and this would be the opportunity to deal the Germans a blow that they would not be able to recover from easily. The fact that the German army had not bargained on a winter campaign was clear when the temperatures began to plunge and German engines began to freeze. There was no antifreeze in the petrol, and also German officers and men didn't have warm winter clothing. In the second week of October, Zhukov examined the defences to Moscow and realised that basically all approaches to the city were wide open. He said, in essence, all the approaches to Moscow were open. Our troops could not have stopped the enemy. He informed Stalin of this and said that the capital was doomed if the Germans chose to attack in strength. The government began to be evacuated to Kuibyshev, 500 miles east of the Volga. And true to form, the NKVD began to execute anyone politically suspect that they had in the prison cells in case they fell into German hands and could be used in ways to further undermine the Soviet Union. Panic looting of shops occurred, and the law and order broke down to the extent that there were even attacks on NKVD officers who were identified by the public. However, despite all this, Stalin on the 18th of October decides to stay in Moscow. He decides that he will be resolute, and this decision serves him very well. Risky, of course. The recognition that he gets from this from the wider population is quite significant later on. On the 7th of November, units who were marching to the front were diverted to stage the traditional celebratory parade through the capital to commemorate the October Revolution. It was Stalin who met those troops and who saluted them, and there was footage of him there, steadfast and ready to defend the city. And it was on that evening that the first snowfalls come. And it's the snowfalls, arguably, that save Moscow. The Germans, unable to move due to the freezing weather, were unable to make the final breakthrough and sat outside of the city. And the troops began to suffer the effects of the cold. Now I'm going to continue with this Operation Typhoon in the next week or so, but we're going to move on now to, in the next few weeks, to other aspects of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, I hope you find this useful. You can always check out my long-form journalism on Patreon, or visitors at the Explaining History Podcast Facebook group, where there's other content there for you. And if you can support us on Patreon, then that would be greatly appreciated. Obviously, doing this podcast is a labour of love, I'll grant you that, but it helps to have some financial support when any of our listeners can afford to spare a little bit of money here and there. Anyway, thanks very much, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye-bye.